Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Lindbergh baby kidnapping. Lindbergh kidnapping. Contact report 247.
What I want to know is whether the German-American immigrant Bruno Richard Hauptmann was actually the murderer of the Lindbergh child, and whether he actually kidnapped it, as has been claimed since that event. Hauptmann denied until his death on the electric chair on the 3rd of April 1936 that he was guilty and that he had never seen Lindbergh, his child, or his house, etc.
Bruno Richard Hauptmann, the American immigrant from Germany, rightly asserted his innocence until his execution. He was indeed innocent, although a large part of the blackmailed ransom was found with him. His assertion that he had the money in custody only for an acquaintance who had given it to him in faithful hands was true in every detail. This acquaintance of Hauptmann was in cahoots with Lindbergh and received a lot of money from him to give the alleged blackmail money to Bruno Richard Hauptmann for the reason that it could later be found with him. This ensured that Bruno Richard Hauptmann could be arrested and charged as a child abductor and child murderer as a result of the falsified charge material, which actually happened after Hauptmann had been denounced. Thus, everything contributed to his being sentenced to death and executed in deliberate guilt of the American hero Lindbergh, who had the actual death sentence. The real murderess of his child, and he consciously saved her from arrest and from the electric chair by inventing a deceitful and infamous intrigue against Bruno Richard Hauptmann, with the lie that his child had been kidnapped while in reality it had already been murdered and hidden in the vicinity of the Lindbergh house. The murderess was Lindbergh's former fiancée, Elizabeth Morrow, whom he suddenly spurned one day because he liked her sister Anne Morrow better, with whom he subsequently became engaged and married her. Elizabeth Morrow, Lindbergh's former fiancée, could not cope with this, as a result of which she increasingly terrorized the entire Lindbergh house and its inhabitants with terrible jealousy scenes. And when the Lindbergh baby was born of her sister Anne, she tried to kill her sister by all means. Lindbergh and his wife Anne knew this, so they never left the child unattended with Elizabeth Morrow. One day, however, Lindbergh and his wife Anne were forced to leave without being able to take their child with them or give it to someone else's care, leaving it with Elizabeth Morrow. When Lindbergh and his wife Anne returned home, they were received by a distraught Elizabeth Morrow, who sobbed and confessed that she had murdered the child in a fit of jealousy by hitting her head on the tiles, shattering his skull. As a result of Lindbergh's earlier relationship with Elizabeth, and the fact that his feelings for her had still not gone out, and that she was also his sister-in-law, who was also loved by Sister Anne, Lindbergh's wife, the three made a joint decision to cover up the murder. It was decided, in common understanding, that Lindbergh, in addition to his lawfully wedded wife Anne, would in future recognize and treat Elizabeth as his wife, as requested by Elizabeth, secretly, of course, after which the police would be alerted and the lie spread that the child had been abducted, but had already been hidden by his own father in the vicinity of her home. The next consequence was Lindbergh's own intrigue, which for the time being was directed against someone unknown. Only through the acquaintance of Bruno Richard Hauptmann did Lindbergh then fall for the German-born immigrant who was a welcome victim for Lindbergh in order not to bring his Elizabeth into suspicion. So he devised a blackmail story together with his friend who was in bondage to him and to whom he gave a lot of money. handed over the alleged blackmail money to the friend, and ensured that Bruno Richard Hauptmann got into disrepute and suspicion, while the friend handed over the false blackmail money to Hauptmann for faithful storage, the end of which took place on the electric chair.
Contact Report 798.
Therefore, I think we should turn to the other matter, namely that of the child Charlie, who was murdered in the 1930s. This is what is often talked about on television, and what really happened back then. I know from Svath, who clarified everything in detail at the time, that Richard Hauptmann, who was sentenced to death and executed in the electric chair, was innocent of the alleged child abduction and the murder of Charlie Lindbergh. But Svath forbade me, I do not know why, to speak openly about what really concerned the connections of the whole murder story until 60 years after the event. However, I once discussed the whole thing with one of you, but I do not remember with whom. What had actually happened, however, still concerns many people today who still do not know that it was a matter based on a far-reaching conspiracy which Lindbergh deliberately brought into the world and which he financed with very horrendous sums of money. Now I want to say what Svath found out at that time, and since we are now in the year 2022, that is to say about 90 years have passed since the event, it should be made clear what Svath had to say about the Charlie Lindbergh murder and what he found out, namely because he personally heckled Lindbergh and put him under the magnifying glass, so that the facts could be learned from the best source. It turned out that the truth of the child abduction was actually quite different from what the conspiracy had invented, and that an innocent man had to lose his life because Lindbergh had lied to make it appear that everything had happened as he himself had lied. So it is perfectly certain, because Svath has clarified everything down to the last detail with his infallible possibilities, that it was Lindbergh himself who had Charlie murdered. Consequently, he himself is to be called the murderer of his own son. That Lindbergh himself wanted to have his little son out of the world. Consequently, he animated his mistress Elizabeth Morrow as a murderess, who then smashed the skull of little Charlie, who was not even 2 years old, but who lived for minutes before he became dead. This, however, was unintentionally observed by the nanny Betty Gow when she entered the room, with whom, by the way, Lindbergh also had a close intimate relationship, as with various other women. What happened at that time shook practically the whole of America, although Lindbergh was well calculated to blame the crime on an innocent man. The whole murder of the boy was based on the fact that Lindbergh did not want a son who was considered a eugenicist, or noble-born, but who was then handicapped, which was not noble, as Lindbergh thought. This was reason enough for him to kill his son or have him killed by his mistress. He was particularly uncomfortable with the whole thing of his disabled son, because he was world-famous as a circumnavigator and father. Consequently, a disabled son would have damaged his reputation, or so he thought. So Lindbergh did not want Charlie, his son, to become a care case, because that would have been a disgrace for Lindbergh, in his opinion. However, he mentally dealt with the disgrace of his disabled child shortly after his birth, when it was clear that the child would become a hopeless foster child. He confessed this to Svath personally when Lindbergh was cornered by him, and no evasion of his lies could help him. So he confessed that he was the actual perpetrator of the murder, which took place in the nursery in front of the eyes of the nursemaid Betty Gow, although this young woman was silenced by money, which later nevertheless ended in a poison murder, because Lindbergh was constantly afraid that Betty Gow might speak after all. To prevent this from happening, Lindbergh hired an assassin who pursued the nanny and finally murdered her with poisoned cake. Charles Lindbergh's son, who was barely 2 years old, suffered from rickets, which caused the English disease as a result of vitamin D deficiency disorders, or a disorder of the bone metabolism, which led to various complaints. In addition, it was largely concealed that the boy also suffered from frequent epileptic seizures, which also did not suit his father. Lindbergh, by the way, was an unscrupulous man who, contrary to false justifications by book writers, other followers, etc., who wanted to clear him with lies and deceit and idolized him, which still happens today. On the one hand, carried out espionage in Germany from the U.S. Embassy, but was also a genuine Nazi and anti-Semite. Lindbergh was indeed an unscrupulous man, who on the one hand worked for the USA, but at the same time was a Nazi and anti-Semite and profited from the fact that he was playing a double game and was heavily remunerated for it. But as far as his son was concerned, who was really ill and suffered not only from rickets but also from epilepsy, as he was also slightly limited in his consciousness, which was usually concealed, this caused Lindbergh to have Elizabeth Morrow smash Charlie's skull in, which this woman actually did because she was in bondage to Lindbergh. Then, finally, to make sure that the young woman Betty Gao kept quiet about what she had seen, he had an assassin murder her in the course of time by sending her, I do not know how and where, pastries soaked in a poisonous detergent or something. Lindbergh also arranged everything himself, such as arranging a ladder big enough to reach the nursery window, thus faking a kidnapping even though Charlie was already dead and taken out of the house. Lindbergh managed this with the help of 2 criminals, but he had to pay them a lot of money. He then used this to tell a lie that he had to pay this as a ransom for the kidnapping of the child, precisely in order to get his child back. However, the fact that he paid a fictitious ransom, which was ultimately played into the hands of Richard Hauptmann, was Lindbergh's full calculation in order to be able to accuse him of being the child kidnapper and Charlie's murderer. Hauptmann was chosen for this in revenge because he refused to take part in this crime, for which a request to him for his assistance had failed. However, Lindbergh also succeeded excellently in getting possession of the alleged ransom money, which gave him further proof that he himself was not to blame for the whole alleged kidnapping and later the death of the child. He even steered the investigation of the partially bought police in certain directions, so that he got out of the murder of his son, although some people still suspected him of being Charlie's murderer. Something that actually corresponded to reality, since his child was murdered on his behalf. In the end, however, an innocent man was murdered in the electric chair for his deed, the German-born Richard Hauptmann. That is what really happened according to Svath at that time and what he found out.